Straight ahead on Law & Crime Daily. A record settlement in the police shooting of Breonna Taylor.
And is the largest amount ever paid out for a black woman in a wrongful death killed by a police in America.
Plus,
we need to know what happened to our father.
The daughters of Carole Baskin's late husband, Don Lewis, stole the show last night on Dancing with the Stars.
And
I said, the last time he was back in the corner, my daughter disappeared. He's back in the corner again. He could kill these children.
social services workers failed to heed those warnings. And now 2 children are dead, their mother presumed murdered. Law & Crime Daily covers court cases from coast to coast. And thanks for joining us on Law & Crime Daily. I'm Aaron Keller along with Terri Austin and Brian Buckmire. We begin in Kentucky, where the city of Louisville will pay Breonna Taylor's family $12 million to settle a wrongful death lawsuit. Police shot and killed Taylor when plainclothes officers executed a no-knock warrant at her home. Gunfire erupted when Taylor's new boyfriend said she mistook the police for intruders. Taylor's mother said today's settlement was only a partial victory.
As significant as today is, it's only the beginning of getting full justice for Brianna. We must not lose focus on what the real job is. And with that being said, it's time to move forward with the criminal charges because she deserves that and much more. Her beautiful spirit and personality is working through all of us on the ground. So please continue to say her name, Breonna Taylor.
The mayor of Louisville said the settlement requires police reforms.
We will now require a commanding officer to review and approve all search warrants, affidavits in support of search warrants, and risk matrices before an officer seeks judicial approval for the warrant. We're creating a clear command structure when executing warrants at multiple locations. We're adding additional protocols for money seized as evidence, expanding the random drug testing of officers, and we will negotiate with the FOP in 2021 to expand on the records that can be maintained in an officer's personnel files.
Still, an attorney for Breonna Taylor's family says advocacy cannot stop with this settlement.
We are not going to stop our calls to hold the officers responsible for Brianna's death accountable. We're going to continue to put pressure on the Attorney General's office to present a fair case to the grand jury, and we're going to wait. We know that that indictment is coming from the grand jury. We have faith that that indictment is coming from the grand jury. In addition to the Attorney General's office, we must remember that the FBI is also doing an investigation into whether there were criminal civil rights violations leading to and after Breonna Taylor's death. So we're going to be looking for the federal indictment to come from the Department of Justice as well.
Brian Buckmire and Terri Austin now for analysis. So Terri, Taylor's family says this settlement basically wraps up their lawsuit against all of the officers. This sounds like this closes the door on the civil case completely.
Well, yes, it does close the door as far as damages are concerned, but the settlement went beyond the monetary payment, Aaron. It also included police reform, like you heard, like requiring the officers to volunteer in underserved communities, and it also is requiring commanding officers to approve all search warrants. So that's going to avoid the type of situation we had here.
And Terri, is it rare to actually get a dollar amount in a settlement? Sometimes those are confidential.
Well, you know, if the parties agree that they can talk about the amount, yes, you can go ahead and do that. It's only if you say that the terms and conditions of the settlement are supposed to be confidential. So here, obviously, they agreed they could talk about the amount. And
some states require those amounts to be open in open records laws and whatnot. So, Brian, does this impact the Attorney General's investigation and the criminal case, and how?
I guess it's twofold. In one aspect, you're thinking about right now the temperature of Louisville. I think this might help subside that because it is a $12 million reward. If you're thinking about it in terms of context, Eric Garner's family got $5.9 million after he was killed. So it is a large amount by many standards. But people are still going to now turn all of their attention to say, hey, if the city's willing to give it $12 million, what about the criminal case?
Let's turn to another case now. The mayor of Rochester, New York, has fired his city's police chief over the controversial in-custody death of Daniel Prude. Shocking body camera footage shows officers putting a hood on Prude's head and shoving his face into the ground while he was naked and handcuffed. The police chief and his command staff announced their retirement after this video became public. But the mayor now says the chief is fired 2 weeks before he was scheduled to step down. The mayor is also calling for a federal investigation and police reforms in that city. The Tiger King star, known for her big cat rescue project, made her debut on ABC's Dancing with the Stars. Carole Baskin danced the night away to the tune of Eye of the Tiger, but during the show, the family of Baskin's former husband had a surprise of their own. Don Lewis was reported missing in 1997. He's presumed dead, and his family speculates Baskin may have been involved.
I'm Linda, one of Don Lewis's daughters, and we miss our dad.
I'm Donna. I'm Don Lewis's oldest daughter. We need to know what happened to our father.
I'm Ann, Don's former assistant. All we're asking is justice for Don.
Don Lewis mysteriously disappeared in 1997. His family deserves answers. They deserve justice. Do you know who did this or if Carole Baskin was involved?
A $100,000 reward has been funded.
That's an incredible ad in the middle of that broadcast. Attorney John Phillips told Law&Crime the purpose of that ad was simple.
We knew Carole Baskin was going to have essentially a captive nation during Dancing with the Stars and get to tell her narrative in full as she wanted to tell it. The problem is she's had that narrative for 23 years and the family hasn't. The scales of justice can balance if both sides get to talk. The fact is everybody's talking about Don Lewis today, along with how bad of a dancer she was. But everybody's talking about Don Lewis today, and if we hadn't aired the ad, it'd have been just a forgotten part of the story.
All right, Brian Buckmire, he's throwing shade there about the dancing. He's taken out the ad in the middle of the broadcast. I mean, how many different ways could he jab at Carole Baskin?
I mean, this was a boxing match. He went from left hook to right hook to haymaker. I mean, the video's about controlling the narrative, and I think they won that because, yes, her dancing was not the greatest and definitely changed the narrative.
I mean, everybody's piling on Carole Baskin here. Let's talk about the lawsuit. There's a civil case going on between the daughters and Carole Baskin. Terri, do they have a chance of getting a judge to even hear it? Because it's been filed more than 2 decades after Lewis disappeared.
Well, you know, Aaron, while Carole is dancing with the stars, the daughters are taking on a very serious business. They filed a lawsuit, and it wasn't actually for damages. It's what's called a bill of discovery. They just want to find out more information about their father and his will. Presumably, that information could lead to a lawsuit, but Baskin's already claiming that any alleged claim would be time barred.
So interesting there that they're basically just trying to dig into this a little bit more.
That's exactly right. She's actually saying, Carole, is the fact that they're just doing a fishing expedition.
And along it moves through the courts. And still ahead on Law&Crime Daily, sentencing for a man who admits he played a role in the murder of a Tennessee 20-year-old. And later on, a husband suspected of killing his wife goes on to kill his children and then himself. Their family explains the warning signs they say the authorities refuse to listen to. And now to a sentencing hearing for a defendant who admitted his role in the killing of a young Tennessee woman nearly a decade ago. Holly Bobo disappeared from her family back in 2011. Hunters discovered some of her remains 3 years later. John Dylan Adams pleaded guilty, but co-defendant Jason Autry testified against Zach Adams at trial.
What are your expectations? You know what I mean by that? For testifying here today. What do you think is going to happen?
I'm hoping for leniency. He asked me would I help him bury the body. And I said, yeah. I said, I will. I brought the upper torso to the end of the tailgate where he grabbed the legs, and I set the head, the upper end, on the riprap pile. I told him, I said, this is still alive. Out of the floorboard of the pickup, he pulls a pistol. I looked around, And I told him that there was nothing coming close as clear, something to that effect. And at that time, boom, the gun sounded, the gun went off. And it sounded like boom, 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 underneath that bridge. It was just one shot, but it echoed underneath that bridge all the way down that damn river bottom.
Autry's plea deal was for an 8-year sentence. He's been in jail for that long, so with credit for time served, he'll basically be a free man.
His testimony was some of the most credible, persuasive testimony I've ever heard given in a courtroom. Plead guilty to facilitating especially aggravated kidnapping. That's an amended charge. Be an 8-year sentence as a range 1 standard offender, 30% classification. Count 2, you'd be pleading guilty to solicitation of murder 1, receive an 8-year sentence, range 1 standard offender, and 30% classification. They will run concurrent. Do you understand what that means?
Yes, sir.
They're also running concurrent with a federal sentence.
Yes, sir.
Let's talk about the procedure of this case, Brian. Autry testifies with hopes of leniency. He did not have a plea deal at all when he took the stand a few years back. The defense said there was no deal whatsoever until 30 days ago, and the judge said the other co-defendants would have been entitled to the same deal if they had been, if Autry had been given one for testifying in the original trial. Does this make sense to you?
So, taking it all on face value and not knowing anything more, what probably happened is one defense attorney said, hey, you might not put a physical deal on the table, but my client has something good to say, and let's see and hope if that rings true and gets him a good deal. So I think this was a bit of a Hail Mary toss-up by the defense attorney, and thankfully someone caught it in the end zone.
This happens differently in different jurisdictions, Terry. In some jurisdictions, and correct me if I'm wrong, defendants won't flip unless they have a deal on the record, right?
Well, that is right, Aaron. And the incentive to flip and testify against another defendant is really based on the offer to either lower the charge or not serve any jail time. And on the one hand, you know, the deal helps you to convict the other defendants, but it brings closure to the case together.
Exactly. All 3 defendants have now been tried or their cases adjudicated. And when we return, the grandparents of 2 murdered children open up to Law and Crime Daily about the abusive father and husband who killed those he claimed to love. The state's failure in that case led to a $98 million verdict. That's when we return. And now to more from my recent conversation with the parents of a young mother presumed murdered by her own husband. Susan Powell disappeared in December 2009. Her husband, Josh, claimed he took their children on a midnight camping trip in sub-zero temperatures when Susan disappeared. He went on to maintain his innocence in her presumed killing. In 2012, Josh locked a social services worker out of his home during a supervised visit, killed his children with a hatchet, and killed himself by setting the house on fire. Susan's parents, Charles and Judy Cox, say they believe Josh killed Susan by offering her poisoned pancakes to eat. They described for us the breakdown of the relationship and their troubling search for answers.
We saw red flags. We felt he was very domineering or spoke so much.
I think a good way to describe it is we saw the tip of the iceberg, and we had no idea how much more iceberg there was underwater. Beyond our vision. We had no idea we were dealing with such a problem. And I know our daughter didn't have an idea of that either.
So Susan disappears, and then that leaves Joshua and the children. What do you think happened to your daughter?
I'm convinced that the pancake episodes stuff was poisoning of Susan, and that he did something, dumped the body somewhere. At the time, I thought, well, maybe she took off, because we had a safety plan that she was going to take off to protect herself. And then I would get down there and she would get in touch with me, and we could get our attorneys involved, and we could battle to get her children back and things like that, to get the children back. And but that she never contacted me. And so then I learned later that he had her cell phone. And so I realized that, yeah, whatever happened that night, he got rid of her, and he was adamant that, well, I wouldn't kill her. I don't know, which I don't believe for a minute, but I know that had he not drugged her or poisoned her, that she didn't realize the danger that she was getting herself into, clearly.
Within 3 or 4 days of her missing, they felt it was a homicide.
And then ultimately, we wind up in the situation where Joshua winds up with the children alone, and it just does the most unspeakable thing possible.
Yeah, Josh had control of the children, and I understood that from the beginning. He is the surviving parent. He's the one person who's there for the children. But when he moved out from his house there in Utah, it was clear to me that he knew she wasn't coming back. That's where in place Susan did not want those children. And when they were there, being grandparents with no rights to say anything or do anything really, no recognized rights, then that's the situation we were in, and we just continued on hoping that the police would find Susan or find evidence that they could use to arrest Josh.
So ultimately, all of your hopes were attached to the police investigation, hoping that that would put a stop to Josh because you didn't have the independent right to jump in and get involved in the situation yourselves. It must have been extremely frustrating.
Josh had all the advantage in being the only parent could speak, and he could speak for Susan as her husband, except for he was speaking against Susan as her husband. So we took on the role of defending our daughter and correcting the things, the lies and the statements that Josh and his family made against our daughter.
And that left the Coxes in a legal nightmare, one which ended with a multi-million-dollar civil verdict handed down recently. When we come back, what Charles and Judy Cox think happened to their daughter and what motive they say their son-in-law had to kill his own children. The grandparents of Braden and Charlie Powell believe the boy's father became increasingly worried when the boys started to remember events surrounding their mother's death, likely at their father's own hands. That left Joff Powell fearful, the Coxes say, that the children may potentially have been on a path to speak out against him.
They were just really trusting us and talking to us. And then they started to say things that were kind of disturbing, and they were starting to remember things. And that really scared Josh. And he wanted, of course, for them to be taken away from us and put with anyone. He said, I don't care who it is, but just not the Coxes, because they're dangerous people.
There was one time Charlie said to me around Christmas time, just before they were killed. Anyway, he said, he had drawn me a picture of a wreath, and it had a picture of his mom in the middle and said, help us find her. And he wanted me to get that to the media so that maybe somebody would start looking for his mother. He finally figured that out, that he would like other people to help look for his mother. And I just remember feeling, oh my gosh, I hope you don't say this to your father, because that would just set him off terribly, that here his son now wants to know where his mother is and was turning to the media, which he'd been taught is terrible, and turning to me to do that. And we're convinced, or I'm convinced anyway, I should say, that Charlie and Braden know what happened to their mother much more than they were allowed to say. And the older they're getting, the more they have words to describe what their night terrors or their dreams about what really happened, the things that they know. And so I think Josh was afraid of that. And he knew his time was about, he was backed into a corner. And the last time he was backed into the corner by Susan, either straighten up or I'm filing for divorce, she goes missing, and we haven't heard from her again.
The state's decision to put the children back together with their father turned fatal, of course, and resulted in the Coxes receiving a $98 million victory against the state. Terri and Brian, let's jump in with some discussion here to wrap up the show, I should say. A huge verdict, one that sends a message. Terri, the civil trial, though, was a mess with social workers basically saying that our procedures say one thing, they're testifying to another thing. The Coxes say that the social workers were lying, sanitizing reports. It was just a mess, from my understanding.
It sounds like a mess, Aaron, and I think the jury made the right decision here. There's no question if the department was not following their own policies and procedures and they were ignoring the pleas of these poor grandparents, then they came down with the right decision and they said that, in fact, the Department of Children's Services was liable. Hopefully, Aaron, this $98 million verdict is going to make a difference and be a wake-up call for the department.
And that exactly is what the Coxes hope. They're saying they want to use the money for advocacy. So, Brian, this was a pretty straight-out negligence case. They won because the state breached a duty of care to look after the children. I got to ask this question, though. When you listen to the grandparents speak, it sounds like they would have been excellent witnesses had the father survived and they needed to testify as to premeditation and a reason why he would have wanted to do this.
What I heard was a very well thought out, reasonable motive as to why this father would have wanted to silence his children. As they said, as children grow, they start to gain the vocabulary to describe instances that they might not have when they were younger. And I think that would have been very fearful if these facts were true and very damaging if it went to trial.
So many what ifs, but we won't have that trial. Thanks a lot, Brian, Terri, for great analysis today here on Law and Crime Daily. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you back here tomorrow with America's hottest real-life court battles.